This is Dateline News and Conversation. Oh, my good friend, Edward Slavsquat, aka Riley Waggaman, is back. Riley, welcome back to the show.
Regis, thanks for having me back on. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, my old friend.
No kidding. All right, you're back in what, North Carolina now?
That's correct. Yeah.
So you'll be coming back to Moscow and Russia next month, I believe, correct?
Yeah, I'll be flying back early March and maybe a few days in Moscow, but then I'm rushing back to my beloved village in Novgorod Oblast. So the cows are waiting for me.
We
Excited
might
to be
ask
back.
you for that at the end of this. I need to know more
Sure.
about that. Okay, so Riley, the big news, Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin. I mean, most of the world, I don't know if that's too much of an exaggeration, we're waiting for this interview. Tucker, a few days before that in Moscow, it was a great PR thing. Oh, I'm here to interview Vladimir Putin. And he said that the reason he came to Russia and wanted to interview Putin is because the American and mainstream media had been lying and not telling the people the truth. And he said, as a journalist, I came to Russia to give the president of Russia, Putin, the opportunity to explain his side of it. I want to discuss with you tonight not only the content, but the impact and the criticisms and the kudos that have come from all over. So, first of all, what was your first impression of Carlson getting this interview with Putin? And then what was your impression overall with the interview?
Well, I guess I would just start by saying I have to applaud the interview. It can only be, in my opinion, seen as a positive thing. I don't understand, in fact, why it was such a big deal to begin with in the first place. Like, whether you agree with what Tucker did put out that little video before the interview and said, "Look, I'm just here to inform people. Uh, the Americans in the West are not getting the other side of the story. We're invested in this war, so we should have more information." And he said at the end of the interview, you can agree or disagree with Putin, but you should have the ability to decide for yourself. And by the way, I totally support that message. I don't understand why apparently there are even calls in the EU to sanction Tucker Carlson, and he's getting a lot of flack in US mainstream media. I think that's ridiculous. I don't understand what is this thing going on with sort of the criminalization of having opinions, or not even opinions, just conversations, is really scary, and it's a global phenomenon. Unfortunately, we have it in you have it in the United States, you have it in Europe, you have it in Ukraine, you also have it in Russia. That's just the reality. So I feel like if it would be great if at least one thing we can get from this conversation is, you know what, actually it's okay for people just to sit down and talk, and maybe you didn't like some way a question was phrased, or you think that Tucker went too easy on Putin, or maybe you thought he went too hard on him, I don't know. But like, just the basic premise of two people talking in a room, I don't see how that can hurt anything. And we're already in a situation where people are dying, and it would be nice for that to stop. So any kind of, nice discourse that could lead to that stopping, in my opinion, should be encouraged, right? So that's my overall big takeaway. I mean, as far as my impressions of the interview, I mean, there's a lot to talk about. So maybe you want to share your own thoughts, and we can talk about specific aspects or specific points that were brought up during the discussion.
Well, let me throw this out. I was never somebody who watched Fox News ever, but I knew who Tucker Carlson was, and people would send me a clip about this or that, and I might watch it or watch a bit of it and then turn it off. But of course, like everybody else, I knew this was a big story when he got fired. And then he started his own network, which apparently I don't know where the hell it is, but it hasn't been taken down. Uh, Elon Musk said, "You're back on my platform. I'm not going to censor you." But what I have seen since Tucker left Fox is, I think, a different person. He seems to be, to me, eager to learn. I've watched a few of his interviews. He doesn't come in there like so many of the mainstream media looking for a gotcha or looking for a soundbite. He generally seems to enjoy learning from people and learning from the conversation. I wonder if you would share that same view, Riley.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't follow Tucker Carlson closely, so I don't really have a strong opinion on that either way. It was interesting though how, the interview starts and Tucker Carlson's just the opening question is like, "So you went into Ukraine because NATO was about to launch a imminent attack on Russia, right?" And Putin was like, not really. Is this a talk show or a serious conversation?" And then of
Yeah,
course
I love that.
we had this very interesting long sort of preamble, I guess, to sort of Putin's explanation for how the current conflict came about, which was interesting, and I think it was I'm sure for many it was new information, and so I'm glad that like again, I think that more information the better. People should have access to the Kremlin's perspective. They should have access to all perspectives and make and decide for themselves. Where it's a difficult endless journey to the truth. So I don't know exactly. I mean, frankly, just it's a good, in my opinion, I mean, it's just a pragmatic, good business choice to get a land an interview with Putin, someone who, for whatever reason, has not really had a chance to um, at least just say his piece in Western media, which is, I think that's just objectively wrong. It doesn't make any sense. And I don't know whether that's because no one was willing to go and talk with him, or he's picky about who he'll talk with, or whatever. But I'm glad that it happened. I'm glad that Tucker did it. I know that there's been criticisms on all across the spectrum about the interview. I don't see any harm in it, and for what it's worth, I'm glad that people are talking to each other. So
Yeah, well, I am too. I asked you if you thought Tucker was different now and that he was really searching to learn, and I believe that. I've seen a number of his interviews that people have sent or that I saw on Twitter, now X. Uh, but I wanted, you mentioned the introduction. I don't think Tucker could have expected the outcome of the whole thing. He sat there and he almost looked like he was mesmerized, but he was obviously very respectful and wanting to look like he's paying attention. But the opening 30 minutes of Putin giving that historical background, I thought was brilliant. As somebody who, my undergraduate degree was in history, and I can't say that I'm a historian, but I have been, in the last 20 years, deeply interested in history. And I believe that the historical context is critically important for understanding human events today. Case in point, Crimea. People don't realize that it was part of Russia since Catherine the Great when she took it from the Ottoman Empire. And it was only deeded to Ukraine by Khrushchev in what now is being questioned as being an illegal transfer to Ukraine. Now, I don't want to get into that part, but Putin obviously felt it was extremely important to set out the historical context, the history of Russia, the changing of borders, the language, the culture to the present day before he was ready to talk about what Tucker really came to talk about was what do you think about and why did you respond the way you did in Ukraine? Now, I wonder if you can kick in and respond to any of that, but do you think that Tucker was somewhat surprised and they didn't get what he thought he might have gotten from that interview?
I mean, I can't say. I guess you could make assumptions based on, Tucker had this before he aired the interview. He had this sort of introduction where he said, Putin spoke for about half an hour about the sort of history behind, gave some historical context to the conflict or just the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. And we thought that it was a stonewalling technique, but we kept it all because we thought it was relevant. So, I mean, let's face it, it's not something that you would normally see in an interview. So I'm sure that he was surprised to some extent. What I would say though and this would sort of tie into topics that I hope and I'm sure we will get into. I would have to say that one of my biggest criticisms of how this conflict has been talked, it's people seem to focus a lot on the past and justifications for it, but there seems to be very, very little in-depth and meaningful discussion about how this conflict is going to conclude in a way that is beneficial for both Russia and Ukraine, which is essential if this special military operation really was worth the blood and treasure that has been expended, unfortunately, over the last almost 2 years now. So while I think that Putin did, he presented the historical context in a very in-depth way, and I think a lot of people found that to be new information and valuable. I have to say that I wasn't particularly impressed with the way that he talked about like what's going to happen going forward. He seemed to sort of kick that question away by saying, well, we want to talk, but the US doesn't want to talk. Well, okay, great. But what happens if the US doesn't want to talk? How does this end well for Russia and Ukraine? And I just wish that there was more discussion on that issue specifically. So,
Yeah. Um, I want to say that I agree with you, that I think this has given people the opportunity to discuss this.
yeah.
Now, I don't think anybody can engage in a conversation about anything that happened if they did not watch it or read the
Mm.
transcript. In other words, if you didn't do that, be quiet, shut up, because you are either intellectually lazy or you're ideologically trapped and you've just discounted even listening to the man. But I think this has given millions and millions of people the opportunity to listen to Putin. And I think a lot of people did. Judging by what I've seen and reactions on Facebook and social media, I don't know any other topic that I've seen so much going back and forth, so many
Mm.
comments on threads as this. And I agree with you. I think that's an absolutely fabulous thing. Let's talk about this. There were a number of things that Putin revealed. One of the things that you mentioned was he said, well, we're willing to talk, but nobody on that side is willing to talk. And so we're talking on different levels, governmental agencies, but not directly with Biden, and obviously probably not with Blinken and Sullivan and Kirby and those people. But you're right. It seems like, well, what are you going to do? But you know what? I think he did. I think he made it clear again that we are going to demilitarize Ukraine. We have to for our own security. But he added that we're going to get rid of and purge this Nazi ideology that has overtaken Ukraine. What did you think about that explanation from Putin? I was surprised that he talked about that more than he did.
So yeah, I guess that you're referring to, there was a very interesting part in the conversation, I think around halfway through, where Tucker basically put this question directly to Putin. He said, has this operation achieved the goals that you intended? And Putin said, no, because Ukraine hasn't been denazified yet. Um, okay, well, I guess that's one goal that hasn't been accomplished yet. But frankly speaking, if you go back and look at Putin's address on February 24th, 2022, and you listen carefully to the explanation he gave for launching the operation, he listed other objectives. The biggest one, actually, was the protection of the people in Donbass. He also talked about the prevention of the formation of an anti-Russia, permanent anti-Russia in Ukraine. And you can also say, just reading between the lines, and basically Putin explicitly says this, is that Russia, or we can no longer tolerate this sort of NATO encroachment or Western encroachment, which poses an existential threat to Russia's sovereignty. In my opinion, none of these objectives have been met. And in fact, all of them, unfortunately, these problems have been exacerbated. With the situation in Donbass, there are still regular shellings in Donetsk, and not just that, but in cities like Belgorod, which is just was part of the Russian Federation before this conflict began. It's really bizarre to me that after 2 years of this conflict, Russia, which is supposed to have the second largest military in the world, has not been able to stop the killing in Donbass. That's a very, very big problem. And I really hope that there's an end to that violence as soon as possible, whether through military means or through some kind of agreement. So that hasn't been accomplished. That's just an objective reality. As far as NATO encroachment, NATO has expanded. And as I know you know, Regis, NATO is holding very, very large military drills on Russia's border. So we have Finland join NATO. Sweden will probably join NATO. It just received approval from Turkey. I think they're just waiting on, I don't know, maybe Hungary or something. But
Yeah,
that's in
Hungary.
process. Yeah, that's very disturbing. And again, I'm sorry, but I think that any objective observer has to say the idea that this would discourage NATO from doing what it has been doing has not been successful. In fact, I think you could say that it's accomplished the opposite, unfortunately. And the thing with the demilitarization and denazification, look, let's be honest with ourselves. Ukraine has never been more militarized than it has today. I mean, the military buildup, of course, began on a certain level 8 years ago with the start of this crisis, including with cooperation and help from NATO, through training the Ukrainian military. But the Ukrainian military was very, very weak in 2014, and it's never been more. There's just no way to argue that Ukraine doesn't have more weapons and isn't more militarized than it has been today, unfortunately. And I guess you can say that, oh no, all the Ukrainian military has been destroyed. Well, people have been saying that for the last 2 years, almost every day. I don't see the battle lines moving significantly over the last year, basically. So I don't know what's really happening there. Like, if the Ukrainian military has been wiped out, I don't understand why the Russian military hasn't, entered Odessa yet. And which, by the way, unfortunately, as things currently stand, I think is not a very likely possibility. So in general, and as far as denazification goes, okay, I mean, obviously it would, promoting Nazi ideology in any country it's shameful, should be scorned internationally, should not be allowed. Russia exchanged some of the worst Nazi offenders, the Azov battalion in Mariupol, for about, I think it was, I don't know, a few dozen 150 Russian soldiers, and Viktor Medvedchuk, who is Putin is the godfather of Medvedchuk's daughter. Medvedchuk is a old-time corrupt oligarch who was basically trying to work the Russian line into the Ukrainian politics for many, many years. Frankly, there's a lot of evidence to show that he backstabbed Russia, and yet he was exchanged for Nazis. So the denazification thing, in my opinion, is not going very well either. So there's a lot of work to be done. We're 2 years into a conflict that has unfortunately killed probably at least tens of thousands and maimed many, many more of what should be, brotherly nations, Ukrainians and Russians, Slavs. And it's very, very upsetting. And again, going back to this idea, well, okay, you can lay out the justification for the war, but if the costs of the war don't, if the benefits don't outweigh the costs, then what's going on here? And also, how do you bring this war to a conclusion where it was worth it, and the outcome is actually better than the pre-war reality? And unfortunately, Regis, I have to say, in my opinion, the realistic outcomes at this point, I mean, it's going to either be a frozen conflict or maybe some sort of demilitarized zone. But this idea that the Russian military is going to be in Odessa or in Kiev, of all places, to me, this is unfortunately, I just don't see any evidence for that happening. I don't know how it could happen at this point. So, in my humble opinion, having observed this for a while and seeing a lot of commentators make some very bold claims that never come to pass, but of course they're never corrected, I have to say that I think the best possible outcome for Russia at this point is some kind of demilitarized zone in eastern Ukraine that will stop the shelling of Donbass and also Belgorod, which should not be shelled in the first place. And it's insane. It's insane that Russia is selling gas, is paying Kiev to transport Russian gas across Ukraine while Belgorod and Donetsk are being shelled. But that's like another thing, I guess. Anyway, my point is demilitarized zone. I think at this point in a ceasefire, I don't know what else Russia can hope for at this point, and it pains me to say it, but unfortunately, the problem with the frozen conflict is that it'll probably just start up again in 5 or 10 years. So in my opinion, it's not a great situation. I feel bad for Ukrainians. I feel bad for Russians. I think they should be brotherly, cooperative states. It's really too bad that Washington and the West have obviously used Ukraine as this, way to basically poke Russia. But unfortunately, the response, which for some may have been justified, I don't know if it's actually going to work out that well for Ukrainians or Russians. So that's my hot take, Regis.
Well, you mentioned a couple of things I want to follow up on. Provocations. Operation Steadfast Defender. 90,000 NATO troops. Hundreds, maybe thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, hundreds of ships, hundreds of fighter planes, spy planes, the whole bit, all along Russia's border, including in the Arctic. It's going on to this day. You mentioned NATO encroachment. And as I try to look at this from Putin's perspective or his inner circle or the military, there's no doubt that they feel threatened. And this has been the question I've had in a lot of people. Russia is, well, I'm going to state it not as a question, as what I think is a matter of fact, has exercised extraordinary patience for each of these provocations, and there are many, including gaslighting people about the fear of Russia invading European countries, the fear of Russia using tactical nukes on Europe. Russia has no intention of doing that, but how is Russia supposed to respond globally or in terms of Ukraine when all of these other provocations are there, each of which could provoke a nuclear response from Russia? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, how much can Russia take?
So, basically, I'm glad you brought this up because actually one of the common themes of what Putin said during this interview was that the West constantly lied to us. And so I'm going to go down the list because I made a mental note of it. So first of all, Putin starts when he's going through the sort of history of the conflict. He says, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moscow was under the assumption that there was no ideological differences between, Moscow and Washington, or Moscow and the West, whatever. And so they had no reason to think of the United States as an enemy anymore, or a rival, or anything like that, that there would be mutual cooperation. And he said, well, that turned out to be not true. Then he says, we were deceived about NATO expansion. We received certain guarantees that NATO wouldn't go an inch east, blah, blah, blah. And we were deceived about that. Then he tells us that, when Maidan first started and things started getting really scary, that there was sort of this emergency meeting between, Moscow got involved, the EU got involved, and there was supposed to be some sort of peaceful political outcome, right, to Yanukovych's government, and some sort of political settlement without having to resort to anything nasty. And so Moscow, according to Putin, Moscow held up its side of the bargain, but the West didn't. So he said they lied to us again. Then he talks about how with the Minsk agreements, he uses the phrase we were led by the nose, which is something that he said many times before, that the Minsk agreement, which, by the way, a lot of people, I think, don't know what the Minsk agreements were, and they're quite controversial because actually the Minsk agreements were about putting Donbass back under Ukrainian control, that it would have a certain level of autonomy, but it would be reincorporated back into Ukraine. It was never about Donbass independence or anything like that. But anyway, it was supposed to be a peaceful political settlement where Donbass would have a certain amount of autonomy, but would be reincorporated into Ukraine. Of course, the killing would stop, which is the most important, and Ukraine would maintain its territorial, borders as they were before that conflict broke out. And as I said, Putin said that's not what happened. What happened was they used, apparently, I think it was Angela Merkel claimed a year or so ago that actually the Minsk agreements allowed Ukraine to build up its military to prepare for a conflict. And so Putin said we were led by the nose about the Minsk agreement. Then what's really, and in fact, in my opinion, this is, well, Putin has mentioned this before, but I was actually a little bit surprised that he stated it so explicitly and more than one time. He said that when the SMO started, we had that very, that sort of famous blitzkrieg, rush towards Kiev, and which was semi-encircled. And according to Putin, agreement was drawn up. There was going to be some sort of ceasefire. The agreement, at least according to Putin, it contained some sort of language about outlawing Nazi ideology. And then, according to Putin, Germany and France came to him and said, "You can't expect Kiev to sign this agreement with a gun to their head. Please pull your troops back." And Putin did that. And then he was lied to again. And then Ukraine actually used that opportunity to build up its military, get supplies from Washington, and continue the war. So I guess like my problem with this idea of how much can Russia tolerate, well, it had a gun to Kiev's head, and then it allowed itself to be lied to again. I don't get this. Like if war is politics by other means, and again and again and again over the last 30 years, Russia has been deceived and lied to and led by the nose. Why would you then launch a military operation to solve this issue, and then sort of decide, well, okay, like we're not going to wait until the issue is actually solved. We're going to take the word of, the West again. It just, to me, it's like I understand the perspective, Regis, but for me, like if you could also look at it another perspective, like how many times can you be led by the nose before you stop allowing that to happen? And it seems that somehow that's happened again. I don't have a good explanation for that, and it's very puzzling to me. So it's like I don't know, Regis. It's just the whole thing is very, very strange. I don't know how we reached this point, and the ceasefire thing, or the how Ukraine reneged. I think that one reason that nobody likes talking about it, because it makes both sides look kind of bad. It makes Moscow look bad because basically it was led by the nose again. It makes Ukraine look bad because it continued a war that could have been resolved peacefully within the first 2 months, and a lot of lives could have been saved. So I think that there's a reason why there's not more discussion about this. By the way, it would be very interesting to see this agreement, because according to guys like Lukashenko in Belarus, this agreement that included this denazification clause was not particularly favorable to Russia. So I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe Lukashenko was lying, but I would like to. It'd be great to actually see what was going to be signed there, and find out, what actually is going on. Why is this conflict continuing, and how is it that Moscow apparently just keeps taking the West's word and doesn't learn from these mistakes?
Yeah. Well, I think they have. Um, I think Putin has made a couple of very important speeches at the end of last year when he basically said no more. We have nothing to talk to the West. Nobody wants to talk to us. Uh, all of these sanctions, all of these threats, we're now moving east. Clearly stated, we're moving away from the West and from the United States. And so the way I interpreted that was Putin basically was admitting he was taken by the nose, he was lied to, but no more. And we've seen now, ever since at least the end of last year, a very dramatic move towards the east with China, with India, my gosh, the whole BRICS movement. Um, I think, in my opinion, I think Putin has learned his lesson. He's admitted that he was naive. He thought we could be friends, but now he's realized that's no longer possible. Um, how do you see this transition? I mean, to me, it's really dramatic. Nobody in the West wants to talk to me, so I'm not going to bother picking up the phone and try to call Biden. I got nothing to say to the guy. They don't want to talk to us. We're going to go to China. And ever since the Olympics in Beijing 2 years ago, China and Russia made it really clear they don't have a formal alliance, but they both said our relationship goes beyond an alliance. And we can see that becoming clearer and clearer every day. Putin mentioned in his speech how much China has been buying from Russia and vice versa, how they've been trading in the yuan and the ruble, and how quickly Russia is the chairperson of the BRICS this year, how quickly China and Russia are moving towards this, they call it a multipolar world. Now, if we try to look at it from that perspective, I think what we're seeing is on the geopolitical level, this conflict in Ukraine, and the purpose of which, as Putin said, and America has said it clearly, is to balkanize Russia and take its resources. On this geopolitical macro level, we can see maybe the majority of countries in the world moving in a different direction, unwilling to submit to American brutality, power, force, and hegemony. I'm wondering, Riley, that Russia and China and others are not seeking a direct confrontation with a declining hegemon, but are trying to build as fast as they can a new global order. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll just briefly touch on how that might connect with Ukraine and then get to your larger question topic. I mean, if China, for example, if Russia's strengthening relations with China can help bring some sort of political settlement to Ukraine, I'm all for it, or if it's BRICS or whatever organization, if there's some sort of restructuring of the geopolitical chessboard and that helps to bring a peaceful resolution to the situation in Ukraine, I'm all for it, 100%, without any preconditions. As for Russia's growing relationship with China, it's true, yeah. So Putin mentioned again, he talked about how trade turnover between the two countries, bilateral trade, it was supposed to be 200 billion. Russia thinks it's actually 230. China reported that's 240, which is great. And also, it's also true that the trade, there's not a big trade deficit. It's basically equal on both sides. So Russia exports as much as it imports to China. Of course, it's basically what's happening is that Russia has a deal that's very similar to what it had with the West, which is it's exporting natural resources, and it's importing electronics and other finished items, which there's good aspects to that deal and there's bad aspects to that deal. It's a huge discussion. I don't have all the figures in front of me, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on. All that being said, even if we take the largest number, 240 billion, trade between the U.S. and Russia is something like 750 billion, right? So there's still a long way to go. Let's put it that way. And I also, if we want to talk about sort of multipolarity, well, look, I mean, look at what Putin himself said. He said that um, that the world should be whole, right? That he sort of used this analogy or metaphor of the brain, how there's two hemispheres, but it's the same brain, and he wanted cooperation with all nations, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that this idea of like on some level, there's always going to be this idea that Russia and China are completely breaking away from the West and are not going to be, they're not going to be dealing with the crazy, Washington and its vassals. I mean, we know just from the current reality that that's not true. And also, I'd have to say, if such a new architecture, sort of geopolitical architecture, helps to stop senseless wars, then that's obviously a huge plus for the average prole, right? But at the same time, you got to look at this holistically and look at the whole picture here. And I would have to argue that if you want to say that the world there's rapid changes happening in the world, um, what's happening domestically in almost every country that I know of, it's a huge crackdown on freedom of speech, a huge uptick in all sorts of digital tyranny, biosecurity theater. Unfortunately, I have to say that BRICS has been used as a vehicle to promote CBDCs, which I consider personally to be a huge threat to human dignity. So there's good and bad, I guess you could say, with this new restructuring. And I think it's also important to remember that a multipolarity does not mean the end of world governance. In fact, it is world governance, just so allegedly on a more equitable, playing field. And if you're someone who is fearful of world government, projects and initiatives, such as the stuff that the World Health Organization peddles, it's not necessarily something that you gotta. I think that there's reasons to be. We got to stay on our toes, right? Like we're not out of we're not out of harm's way yet by any means.
Well, I agree with you. Uh, we're in harm's way on a number of levels. But the other thing that you mentioned earlier that I think is important to bring out here, Russia has not completely disassociated itself with the United States. I just read today the United States imported more uranium from Russia last year than ever before. The United States somehow is getting and buying Russian gas or oil, diesel fuel. European countries are now somehow secretly importing Russian gas and, in some cases, rare earth minerals that they need for their industry. You mentioned that, hey, Russia's at war with Ukraine, but Ukraine is collecting money for the passage of gas to Europe.
Yeah.
And so you have to scratch your head if you're somebody that's like in a spaceship looking down at the globe and seeing all of this happening, you're saying, wait a second, what kind of craziness or madness is this? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, well, look, I agree, and Regis, it's such a good question. I wish I had a really, unfortunately, I think I just have to settle with a very simple answer, which is the politics is for the proles, and the rich guys just keep making money, right? Like there's some things that basically nothing changes for the oligarchy, no matter which country you're in, and with the oil and gas thing, it's actually quite a fascinating story because what's actually happening is that Russia is exporting crude to India, which then processes it and ships it to Europe and into the United States, actually. And so it hasn't actually stopped the West from getting Russian oil. It just goes through a middleman And so it's been great for India, but I don't know how great it is for, stopping the Western imperial machine, because it's still getting Russian natural resources. And as we both mentioned, Ukraine is being paid to transit Gazprom's gas across its territory, even as all this horrible killing is going on, which ends up in Europe. And so, in my honest opinion, I gotta say, for me, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't think Ukrainians and Russians should be killing each other if their governments are willing to cooperate to transport gas to Europe. That doesn't make any sense to me. I feel like if the first step would be, all right, you've really pissed us off. Enough already. We're gonna sit down and negotiate this and stop what's happening, or we're cutting off, the gas. But for some reason that didn't happen, and that's disappointing in my humble opinion. I feel like that's the first step, and that violence should always be the last. It's like the worst case scenario, the last thing you do. But I don't know what to say. I mean, again, Regis, though, but this sort of goes back to my point about BRICS and multipolarity. I think there's this idea that BRICS is going to cut off all cooperation with the West, but that's just not true. I mean, look, the global economy is interconnected. If you look at what BRICS says during its summits and then compare it to what the IMF or the G20 say, their statements are basically identical. They really are. Like on all the key issues, they're very, very similar. And so you have to wonder, like, okay, it's good that developing nations are able to cooperate more closely together, and maybe they'll create some new systems to bypass Western sanctions, which create an unfair advantage. And it's bad when international finance is used for political reasons. I get that. But if everyone is still cooperating with each other and everyone's still developing some rather unsavory things on the domestic level, you have to wonder why, like an average Russian or an average Brazilian or an average American or average Canadian would get too worked up about anything if nothing's fundamentally going to change for them. But maybe there will be positive change. I guess time will tell.
What it seems to me is there is probably one more globalist agendas going on here. I do think there is a globalist agenda. When people talk about that, they talk about Klaus Schwab, they talk about the United States and UK and the financial elites having a globalist agenda. And then you wonder how Russia fits into that. You wonder how other countries fit into that. Because as we've been talking about, what politicians do and what the people say is really very different than what is really happening. And the way I see it is I think there is competition between globalists, but they are all being very pragmatic, because I think they know that neither side can afford to crash, because if either side crashes, the global economy crashes. If Russia or China collapse, the American economy, Western collapse, and vice versa. If the American economy, Western economy collapses, China's got nobody to send all their stuff to.
Right.
And so, I find it very confusing. And I have to come back to what you and I are really talking about. We're searching for the truth. We are committed to finding the truth, to arguing, to sharing information, to dialoguing, prepared to be slandered and castigated, but searching for the truth. And I want your thought on this final note, as far as I'm concerned. What I think is at risk is not one country or another, one system or another. I think what's at risk is our basic humanity, who we are as human beings, what we hold sacred, what is important, what are our values, And this is what I think ultimately is under attack and what's at risk. What are your thoughts on that?
I would definitely put my stamp of approval on that one, Regis. And I would even, well, again, just to tie it back to how this conversation started, whatever your opinion is on the Tucker Putin interview, whether you know, whatever you think, I really hope that people understand it's important for people to talk to each other. It's important to have dialogues. It's way better than killing each other. People who have different opinions on something doesn't make them a bad person. In fact, we often learn from each other, right? From people with different opinions. So more talking. I'm pro talking and anti, political repression for these so-called crimes of opinion, which apparently has become very popular around the world these days, unfortunately. As for sort of attacking our humanity, I mean, absolutely, Regis. And I would also really urge people to do everything they can to preserve their humanity, and don't allow world events or other people to bully you into surrendering your humanity for some sort of alleged greater good or whatever, some talking point you read on the internet. Um, be okay with just being yourself and being a human, and rooting for the humans is definitely the way forward. And I know that that can be interpreted in different ways. I guess you just got to make those kind of decisions for yourself, what that means to you. But you know, we have to remember that really, uh, we're all very similar, and it's this tyranny of small differences, which I think is the cause of a lot of hatred and horrible violence and needless suffering in the world. And it would be great if we could overcome this somehow. It's a big ask, but we can all do our part. So
Well, you and I have been living in Russia, you much longer than I have. Um, Neither one of us have found anyone here that's an enemy.
yeah,
Um, we have interacted with people across all demographic groups. You just mentioned it. We're all basically alike. They are so much like us. If Americans could only realize that Russians are so much like them in
yeah,
terms
yeah,
of their passion for sports, for entertainment, for culture. Um, and I don't know about you, but and I know you've lived in other countries in Europe. I've had the opportunity to travel across Europe and down through Japan and South Korea. Um, and I've interacted with these really different cultures. We've somehow transcended the language barrier. Some of them speak English, but if they don't, you can use sign language. It's easy to communicate. And I found that I don't care what the color of your skin is, I don't care what your religion is. People, if they're left alone without government, without these issues, these tiny things that tear us apart, we're all one human family. And I think for me, that's one of the things that I'm grateful for, that I've had this opportunity not to travel the entire globe, but quite a lot of it, and to encounter people as other human beings. And as you said, Riley, we're the same.